Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Sean Guillory, who attained his Ph.D. in Cognitive Neuroscience from Dartmouth College, where he primarily worked with neurosurgery patients to help improve the mapping for brain functions that were personally important to their lives. He is currently employed at Booz Allen Hamilton, where his cognitive domain efforts utilize automation, biometrics, and social science to solve customers' problems. And Sean's opinions during this discussion are his own and do not represent the positions of his employer. Dr. Sean Guillory, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you so much for having me.
The discussion I would like to have with you today, Sean, is going to be a bit of a grab bag of topics, which all can be nested under the heading of cognitive neuroscience. So we're going to touch on items like human-machine interface, cognitive electronic warfare, robotic process automation, and some of the considerations there, and also something that you call Grammarly for disinformation. But before we get into those topics, could you give our audience a quick overview of what you think of with cognitive neuroscience and also your background?
Understood. When folks usually talk about cognitive neuroscience, it would be studying these different things either in cognitive psychology, it could be social psychology, but different kind of aspects of psychology and looking at the neural correlates of what these different functions are in the brain. So usually when you get to the cognitive neuroscience stage, you're utilizing methodologies and different sort of things to study phenomena that have seemed to be replicated pretty well just behaviorally and looking for the effects that you want and trying different ways to study them within the brain. Probably the more one that gets the most pictures and the most press would probably be utilizing things like functional magnetic resonance imaging or FMRI. But there's other things in terms of like scalp EEGs, different ways where not just looking at the correlates, but trying to get down to the causality aspects, which usually that's some sort of stimulation based, like non-invasive stimulation would be transcranial magnetic stimulation or TMS. And I was just afforded the ability to, when working with neurosurgery patients, to use the different kind of names for intracranial EEG, electrocorticography or ECOG, in terms of when the electrodes are directly on and in the brain, where you're able to do recording and stimulation and look at the brain, the human brain, with the best spatial temporal resolution possible, and just able to do that, like I said, like fantastic. But it was just something where using these different methodologies to really get at these different phenomena of like what makes us human. I'd probably say that's the best way to kind of categorize cognitive neuroscience in a nutshell.
We didn't talk about this before we got started, so this is a little bit of an ad hoc question. But are you familiar with the famous AI researcher Marvin Minsky?
Yeah.
I've heard him tell a story about some of his earlier work where I think he worked with like crayfish or lobsters or crabs or something like that, but he took off like their claws and was able to hook up the nerves for those mechanisms and control the claws through electronic signals. And so when you were describing some of your or some of the neuroscience related work, like stimulation, and this area of the brain lights up. Is there a relatively direct lineage between the kind of work that Minsky was doing and today's cognitive neuroscience?
Yes. And when we talk about those electrodes being directly on and in the brain, they're there for clinical function first and foremost. They're there to try to, when you get to that stage of neurosurgery, which we'll just talk mainly about like epilepsy surgery in this stage, but by this point, all non-invasive methods of mapping the brain have been exhausted, and they determine there probably is a locus of where this epilepsy is coming from, some sort of dysplasia or something else. We just need to pinpoint exactly where it's coming from. With the best spatial temporal resolution, they go through a first surgery, which is placing all the electrodes on the brain. They wrap folks' head up, and they usually stay in their bed, hopefully no more than 2 weeks, and they're just waiting to have seizures. And from there, they're able to determine, okay, this is where it seems to be coming from. And if we were to do a resection, this is where we need to cut and try to preserve everything else. The other aspect to that is, okay, this is where the dysplasia is. What sort of functions could be around that area that we may need to cut out? Because they usually categorize as eloquent cortex. As much as you can save those areas around where they would need to do the resection, the better in terms of the kind of quality of life things that they'd be needing, or knowing what kind of things you're going to have to work on with neurorehabilitation afterwards. So first and foremost, it is a clinical function, but yeah, you are able to, in terms of trying to map for what are the functions that are around these areas and what are you covering with these electrodes. You're able to both do recordings while folks do different tasks, and you're able to do the stimulation the same way. And that goes all the way back to folks like, I'll just throw a name out for the audience, Wilder Penfield. Which in terms of functional neurosurgery is like one of the founding fathers in that. And looking at his work, you'll find a lot of the kind of stuff in terms of working with humans and like directly stimulating their brain in terms of looking for function. And yeah, you're just like, the typical sort of things you get for function are going to be either motor or sensory or speech arrest, where they're not be able to speak. You get some things where they start speaking in gibberish. And then you get some really fascinating ones. I'd probably say one of the more fascinating, like high-level cognitive things that you would see every once in a while would be something that the literature, I'm probably butchering French. I apologize to everybody that hears this, déjà vécu, but it's VECU. But what that is, this déjà vécu, is you stimulate an area and it almost, folks don't feel like they know they're not there, but they have like this strong memory, like, oh my gosh, I feel like when I was a little kid and was painting fences, or like every time you stimulate that area, it makes me think and feel and remember this, and it's stronger than a memory to them. That's probably one of the more interesting kind of like high level effects that you get every once in a while in terms of stimulating with these patients. And yeah, you're just able to see that. And with the stimulation, because we go back to these other methods like fMRI and EEG, you're getting the correlates, which, okay, I can record your brain while you're doing this, and you can get the correlation of like, okay, what's going on here, but you don't know exactly what's causing it, especially when we're looking at things with the brain. We're talking network effects here. So localization by itself is not something that is going to ever tell the whole story. But what you're able to do when you're able to stimulate an area, you're able to say with certainty, okay, when this area is stimulated, different things with like voltages and, amperage, being of consideration as well. When you stimulate this area, we can certainly say with this person, this is what's going to happen, especially if you get something that is repetitive and replicating in that way. So hopefully that was helpful.
No, yeah, very, very much so. So maybe we can, drop this conversation into our first subtopic of human-machine interface or human-machine teaming.
When we usually use things with like human-machine interfaces, my goodness, it's even also a pretty classical term where you may have heard it more in like ergonomics. That was seen as some sort of, so even the fact of the computer mouse being some sort of, again, like human and computer interface in terms of the very classical sense. Usually how that is termed now, it would be utilizing biometric measures that would be like scalp EEG or scalp brain signal, or even stuff with like heart rate, galvanic skin response, and these other sort of biometrics and these measures in a way that's informative of what's going on in the situation on the ground. So the more kind of like classic thing would be, not classic, but it's just more happening now, would be things with like EEG, with things like, I've seen them in different kind of like things like flight simulators. I've seen some things in terms of EEG around things with like incorporating like virtual reality and AR, and seeing what's going on in terms of and what you're able to get with the EEG pretty consistently is aspects of like drowsiness and sleepiness. And still with like sleep studies, scalp EEG is the way to go. So you may have heard of things like delta waves and theta waves, or these different kind of things where you're in REM sleep in terms of the waves. That would be utilizing scalp EEG. So in terms of sleepiness and arousal, things with EEG is very much the way to go. And then there's also a lot of things looking at EEG with cognitive load in terms of, okay, like, am I being overloaded? You have these things because a lot of these kind of systems that we're doing in terms of defense and national security, there's just these huge information systems, and again, if you miss a sound or if you miss a light, it could be something, and it could be because, again, there's just so much things in front of you. So it's something we're very much in terms of like, okay, are these folks being overloaded right now?
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that I've been hearing about. I mean, but I'm sure that well, as you've been describing, that's just a slice of the realm of human-machine interface. But a little teaser for an upcoming episode. I've got a interview coming up with a F-35 fighter pilot. His name is Hazard Lee, but he describes what you're talking about here as well, Sean, is how his heads-up display has like icons and avatars, which make it easier for him as the pilot of the aircraft to understand his environment, situational awareness, to reduce his cognitive load, so he has higher level functioning, and he's not, like working with a whiz wheel or something. You know what a whiz wheel is?
Yeah, I usually do from talking with other pilots.
Yeah, that's right. So he's not dialing in azimuths on his little handheld abacus, trying to operate at Mach 1 or whatever. But anyway, that's a sidebar. But it sounds like there's a lot of studies happening which are attempting to leverage what we know about the brain and how information is processed in order to present information to decision makers that it enable a more fluid decision-making environment or something along those lines.
Yeah, and the more that it could be also, a lot of it's still in like the training and the simulation environment, but the more these things can also like be deployable in the field. Say it's something where, again, if it's like underneath the helmet and you're wondering like, okay, is like someone overloaded or someone kind of down? If there's just things that could be helped to be it medics or be it any kind of other planning that could be helpful in that. Those are kind of variables that in terms of the human computer interface that could be helpful. And then, yeah, I really am excited to hear more about that upcoming guest, because that other aspect, which I won't go into things in terms of specifically like the F-35, but the other kind of aspect where you hear human computer interface would be in that human machine teaming aspect where, okay, human, meet this AI system that's been trained on this, and this, which there's certainly been some things, impressive scores with AI systems, specifically in the visual domain. Like, my goodness, in terms of even things like different sort of things like CAT scans and MRIs, and utilizing AI systems to kind of find these things. They've definitely been giving the neurologists and the radiologists kind of a run for their money in terms of how good they are. So in terms of, there's just going to be more and more utilizing of machine learning and AI within our defense and national security space. And how do we work for that? First things first, like, how do we get folks to, trust these systems? Should they trust them? There are aspects, especially if we're talking about the kind of near peer adversaries that we're coming up with, that would know how to take the adversarial machine learning approach, or know how to mess with these information systems to make them possibly give false information. So there's certainly times where, and possibilities where, okay, maybe I shouldn't be trusting what the AI is spitting out right now. So it does go both ways. And it's just a really interesting space to be in right now.
Yeah, for sure. And it also must go into the space with machine exoskeletons as well. Yeah. You mentioned the ergonomics of your hand in a computer mouse. Well, wearing an exoskeleton that's mechanized takes that to all kinds of new levels. And I can imagine I would be a little leery about putting on an exoskeleton, and what if that thing malfunctions, or I'm not moving my arm in the same way that the skeleton is moving my. I can imagine all kinds of nasty stuff happening potentially. So trust, as you said, is a big part of all this.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. Can we transition, Sean, to our next item on the menu? Cognitive electronic warfare. Could you give our audience a little bit about the kinds of things you're thinking about as far as cognitive EW?
With that one, I feel like I'm in the middle of like a term warfare battlefield in terms of exactly defining one that everybody would agree in terms of cognitive electronic warfare. A lot of what I hear in terms of cognitive electronic warfare would be one of using these things like machine learning and AI to help find the different kind of signatures like very quickly, more quickly than a human can do it, in terms of looking at counters and counters. In terms of looking at the automation of that, I guess like the cognitive aspect would be like, okay, these things are smart, so you claim it as cognitive. The kind of definitions, which I'm not the originator of this, but the more in the fold of the definition I kind of see cognitive electronic warfare would be having folks think about different things in terms of using spectrum, or using these electronic warfare and using things with signal, but in thinking about it and keeping in concepts of, okay, what do I want the adversary, or even my troops, what do I want these folks to do or think, or how to behave? With the most classic scenario in terms of, if we're talking in the IO space or the PSYOP space, would be the hearing of the, crying woman or the baby somewhere in the background while you're in the field, and folks using that to divert troops from where they're supposed to be going because they think that there's danger, and getting folks, again, either being distracted or thinking that there's anything different, like, okay, I want folks to be distracted by this, or, oh, I want folks thinking this about the scenario. But usually in terms of like different kind of electronic warfare means, so it could be in the information space, but the thing I kind of more introduced to that would be when EW is used to directly influence the neural system. So doing stuff in terms of like fooling folks with the information, I would consider that more indirectly in the umbrella, of course, but more indirectly. But the more direct thing would be the biggest kind of like headline news example would be things around the quote unquote Havana syndrome, which a couple of years ago in Cuba, both American and Canadian diplomats, there was complaints like, okay, like what's going on with their head? They're complaining about these injuries, they're vomiting. It's not just them, it's their families as well. And big mystery and like, what the heck is going on here? Is it something in terms of poisoning? Is it something in terms of, they all hear this like loud chirping. So is it something more sonic and auditory in that regard? But the consensus has kind of landed, including what was published recently in the National Academy of Science report, that is very likely this is directed energy based, probably something around high power microwave. So literally using electronic warfare and EM spectrum to directly influence the neural system. And just putting it out there, you know, this isn't something where it's like, it's in the news all the time. And these attacks have not stopped. They are very much going on, with Germany and Vienna probably being the real hot spots for where these attacks are going on. So it certainly wasn't a one-off, and it's something where in terms of understanding the bio and the neural effects, there's certainly good folks that are working on that now. And one of the things I wanted to put out there when we're thinking about cognitive electronic warfare, yes, we are talking about stuff that's directly influencing our neural systems, and studying and looking at it a little bit more so we can come up with good countermeasures is, I think, a big national security priority.
Yeah, that is really interesting and worrisome use case. This kind of stuff can get into the sci-fi realm real quick, and you know, so I mean, maybe this kind of thing is far away off, or maybe it's just complete sci-fi, but it's a useful example. So I watched a little bit of this show. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. I don't remember what channel it was on. Maybe it was HBO, or maybe it was just like, it was like a YouTube original or something, but it was called Raised by Wolves. And I didn't actually watch the whole thing, but I watched a couple of episodes. Raised by Wolves. And so it was the premise is something like, I don't know, humanity, distant future humanity, somehow we have, you know, are an interplanetary species now, but it starts off with a group of children, legitimate human children, who are being raised by robots, artificial intelligence beings, and they look human, but it's clear that they are robots. Anyway, you know, the story unfolds, and this one robot uses, you know, attacks another human using some kind of a sonic weapon, and she, you know, opens her mouth and makes a sonic noise, and it destroys the person just with sound.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so it's like, you know, imagine like, you know, someone singing and breaking a wine glass, except that on a person, right? You know, so it's like screech, blap, and the person's head explodes. Okay, so that's sci-fi, but
yeah,
do you think that EW weaponry is kind of going in that direction to be able to emit some kind of a sound or a wave, and there's a more direct effect on people and their cognition and the way that they navigate around the world?
Excellent question. And then, yeah, let me even just go first on like the sci-fi aspect. Yeah. And even trying to the victims of the attack trying to explain, you know, I guess even just saying it out loud, some invisible weapon has, you know, like damaged my brain. It just seems kind of like, huh, where again, you can't necessarily sense it or touch it. You know, it does seem again just very far out. I guess also the same could be the same in terms of things within the information space, where again, like this digital thing has, you know, radicalized people to do whatever. So again, like I don't
Right.
take it
Yeah.
too
Yeah.
far off in terms of that. To answer your question, yeah, in terms of different things with affecting neural signatures, in terms of EW weaponry, it's certainly one of the things that keeps me up at night. And the reasons why I say these sort of things is because if I understand it correctly, the story of kind of with EW and IO, like starting in the 90s, they seem to kind of mirror each other from the folks that I talk with, where both had kind of, you know, somewhat funding. In comes in the 90s this cool kid cyber who takes a lot of the oxygen, the funding out the room, and both EW and IO kind of got deprioritized. But at the same time, the folks that we're calling near peer adversaries now, they threw a bunch of funding, both in terms of like IO and information confrontation models, and with EW spinning up like state key laboratories focus on EW and picking up on the research where, you know, folks in terms of the United States just kind of left it. But now we come to the day where, you know, some of the biggest, you know, battlegrounds will be around like the information, disinformation, and countering malign foreign influence. And then what we're talking about with these Havana syndrome cases, we're playing almost like 30 years of catch up in terms of like what's going on in terms of the bio and neuro, that our near peer adversaries could be farther ahead on that, because even the aspects with what's going on with the Havana syndrome, okay, if it's high power microwave, it seems to be smaller than things that, you know, we traditionally worked on, since it seems like it's portable. It's not something you have to throw on a Humvee to get to work. So in terms of some of the mysteries around that, and could it do something instead of just make my head hurt? Are there things that say target to make folks like really, really sleepy? Let's take the plane scenario. Okay, you don't even have to attack. You don't even have to attack the plane. You use some sort of weaponry, and it makes the pilot really, really sleepy. Like these kind of things are troubling if folks are going that direction, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not out the realm. Again,
Right.
like it would be, you know, bringing in again like more things in terms of cognitive neuroscientists and neuroscientists around this regard to see where these things can happen. And I'm hoping to
Right.
be as helpful as much as I can the space to
Yeah.
curtail that sci-fi scenarios that you're kind of bringing up right now. So yeah.
Right, but the point that you're making there towards the end is a good one. It doesn't have to be the sci-fi catastrophic shot to bang type scenario. Anything that has been empirically demonstrated to cause someone to feel a little bit more drowsy or lethargic is an effective weapon. You don't have to, you know, kill somebody in order to have an effect on the battlefield, or you could even have something presumably that could be deployed at the society level that could like dull the cognitive abilities of an entire society, which would also be catastrophic.
I actually have a pretty good example that's like been deployed, and folks can look up if folks to look up mosquito alarms, which are these they emit these very high-pitched vocalizations. The frequency is escaping me right now, but they emit these high-pitched vocalizations that people over 25-ish aren't able to hear, but people younger, they're like, my ears are so much. And it is something where, you know, I tested in terms of like UX, and like other people like, turn it off, I hear it. And these are the things that I think if they were in America, I'm not sure, but like all the kind of videos you see, they were kind of like in Britain, and they're kind of like used for like anti-loitering. They're like, okay, it's late at night, like kids give away. They throw on the mosquito alarms, but again, older folks wouldn't be able to hear it, so it's just like, okay, what's going on? But the kids are like, ah, so yeah, that would be
Okay.
kind of like an example of that right there. And then even uh, other sort of things, and why I mentioned UX earlier, that actually came from conversations I was talking with like user experience related folks. And some of the stuff they told me which let me go back, user experience is usually utilizing different sort of cognitive aspects to help out with things like websites or applications. And they're the things that help kind of make the front end look appealing and want folks to kind of like work with it. But I was even seeing some stuff that were like, oh, if you utilize this combination of like red and blue together, it usually is something that kind of is seen as like an annoyance to like male population, but females don't necessarily see that. And they like showed me the data on that. I'm like, holy cow! Like, so there's even just things like color combinations that could be used as deterrent or to use to like filter in some folks, but kind of like filter out others. So there are some interesting kind of like concepts within that I hope to integrate as well. So yeah.
Almost like camouflage, or like sights and sounds that are invisible to some people, but perceptible to others. And finding out what those sights and sounds are can and somehow help direct people's attention, or
Drive them away.
or the other way around. Yeah. Wow, that is fascinating stuff. All right. Well, let's traverse to our next topic, robotic process automation, or RPA.
Yeah.
This is a big buzzword in the digital transformation space. But could you give our audience who may be unfamiliar a quick 101 as to what RPA is, just in general?
Sure. Robotic process automation is utilizing particularly low code and no code kind of applications to help automate things that are usually seen as like very time consuming, but they're repetitive, and the decisions are, they could be mapped on kind of like an if then scenario. Like if this happens, you do this, or you clearly do this. There's no like coin flips, there's no like human decision needed. And so typical scenario would be, okay, I need to pull data from somewhere. And the interesting thing about like these different kind of RPA solutions, examples being UiPath, Automation Anywhere, Blue Prism, no matter kind of where the data is, be it like, okay, you don't have an API for us to read the data, but you have a front end, cool. These kind of RPA solutions can get the data wherever they are, spreadsheet, email, pretty good with certain kind of like Xerox sort of things. So those kind of like PDF files, wherever the data is, it would get it, even if it's thousands, tens of thousands of different places. Pull it in, do any kind of formatting or any kind of simple analyses that you need. You can also incorporate machine learning sort of things like, okay, I want this all to go through like this Python script. So that's possible as well. And then you would put the data back to wherever it needs to be. Like, okay, it started in an email, but I need it to be in this database, legacy or not. I need it to be in the spreadsheet. I need it to be in this third-party application, like posting different kind of like financial information and like put it back into like Bank of America or something like that. And there's just a lot of these different scenarios where it's a very helpful tool, but it is something that's seen as more simplistic than like a machine learning AI solution, which a machine learning solution, you train it using these different examples, and then you would test it and see like, okay, did you get it right depending on what the scenario is? versus RPA is a little bit more on rails in terms of, okay, you have to have your process pretty cemented. And some of the aspects is even doing some process reengineering with clients and with folks on the spot. And a lot of it's even just helping folks get their process down on paper for the first time ever. But that's usually more the hard part, like understanding what the process is, seeing if they want to do improvements, and then once it's really mapped up, and it is something where it's clear if-then situations, RPA is certainly a way to go. And it's a way to go in a way where you don't have to necessarily be like uber Python, MATLAB, R kind of like programming level whiz. It's usually drag and drop source scenarios using these different kind of flow charts. And again, there's helpful scenarios within the cognitive space and without the cognitive space, but usually it is kind of like a pulling of a data that would be very hard, more than just scraping sort of scenario, more targeted than that, and working with the data however you need it.
Right. So my understanding is that RPA over the last, say, 3 to 4 years has really come onto the scene and is saving organizations, depending on the size, tens of thousands of hours of human time, and also reducing error rates from human related processing of business related activities. Would you say that that's about right?
Correct. And I've certainly seen the scenarios where you go from 16 hours of work down to the bot doing it in 10 minutes. But let me also kind of caveat this. I've never seen an RPA scenario where it took somebody's job in that kind of regard. So I kind of wanted to put that out there where let's even take some scenarios where there may be some like trepidation in terms of, oh my gosh, I felt like it's taking my job. Well, the stuff that's like really repetitive and folks kind of didn't want to do, the really, again, like moving grains of sand with tweezers from here to there sort of thing, like, oh, why do I have to do this? That's the kind of stuff that the bot can take from folks. And then it would like spit out the different reports or the audits that folks need that the bot's not going to be able to process that. That's something that the subject matter expertise of the folks in that, and they can take more time to do that, kind of comb through the analyses and be like, oh, okay, I actually noticed this here, versus the hours it took and still having the same deadline at the end, the hours it took to do the processing. Now much more of that time can be looking in terms of data exploration and doing the analyses. And it's one of those kind of scenarios also where I've heard of folks who are like accountants before computers were a thing, and there was like a lot of grumbling on, oh, the computers are going to take their job. I dare anybody to find an accountant nowadays, like, okay, I need you to do what you do, but you can't use a computer. They're like, what's wrong with you? And that ends up kind of being what happens with the RPA. If it is something where like after the solution's out, and it does have to be down for whatever sort of reason, it's a lot of grumbling, like, hey, what's going on about? Like it's not going back to the days where, again, they had to move the grains of sand. So those are the kind of solutions that I at least hope to enable. And I think a lot of folks that do RPA try to do it as well.
Right. So clearly RPA helps to reduce the cognitive load or increase humans' capacity to do things that humans are better at than and machines can do the mundane stuff. But like so many technologies, there's opposite sides of the same coin, where there's benefit on one side, but on the other side, it introduces additional risk into organizations. And so I wanted to see if I could ask you to talk a little bit about that. Like for example, I would think that if you have these AIs deployed within organizations that are receiving information, they've got their their code, their algorithm, and how to process that information and then spit out outputs to another AI potentially. But if you have a whole bunch of these things laddered together, it can be susceptible to information attacks, and it just processes the information that they receive. And if that information is tainted, then that's going to get sucked up into the algorithm and get processed by the organization. And it might not take too long before the organization is making bad decisions because the information is tainted. Anyway, can you take that in whatever direction you think is productive, or maybe I've got that wrong?
No, I'm actually so glad that that you brought it up, because I do think that looking at the security and defense aspect of not just like the process automation solutions, but just AI in general, I think there needs to be like more of a priority and more of a look at that, because with the field kind of being the kind of word, if folks want to search it more, would be I think they kind of settled on adversarial machine learning. I have seen some stuff in terms of machine learning security in terms of a keyword, but usually in terms of like these adversarial AI, these things are very delicate to the kind of things you're talking about, like the poisoning of the intake information, or putting in these different sort of things, especially if it's learning on the go sort of bot, like some of these chat bots, the whole situation of I guess even within the information space, like turning chatbots into, like Nazi sympathizers and whatnot, in terms of like the old Microsoft Hey. These things are fragile to these different sort of attacks, and in terms of looking at how to defend these AI assets, because the more these things are getting deployed, which they are getting deployed, and there's more and more interest, more than ever, to utilize these machine learning and AI and these RPA solutions within there, we have to look more in terms of the vulnerability. And yeah, like I said, this one I definitely have a solution, but I do put it out there more of a call to action in terms of really looking at the defense aspect of AI systems and how we can better protect them.
Right. Okay, let's move on to our last subtopic here. This is something that you've called Grammarly for disinformation. Could you start with, well, first of all, for those in our audience that may be unfamiliar with Grammarly, what is Grammarly, and then how are you looking to make a Grammarly for disinformation?
Oh my goodness! So Grammarly is an application that helps folks in terms of with their writing of a document and looking for different sort of mistakes, usually grammar and better ways to say it. They're more kind of more colloquially accepted.
It's a more advanced version of Clippy via paper,
exactly.
the Microsoft paperclip.
Clippy on steroids. So
That's
it's
right,
Clippy on steroids.
Yeah.
But it's also like the closest analogy or metaphor when I hear from folks that work in IO or IW and wanting like an AI or machine learning kind of solution, where like, okay, I want something where we go to a screen or a message board or even Twitter or whatnot, it automatically detects where the disinformation or misinformation may be. It like highlights it, and then it can also give suggestions in terms of what you should do or how to combat it, and different sort of strategies that way. That's usually what I hear from folks in the field in terms of what they would like from like a machine learning AI solution. Search around and there's just nothing out there like it. But again, like just in all my notes, because folks make it really sound like Grammarly, so I just put Grammarly for disinformation. So I just almost put that as like a call to action of folks, because folks who are, anybody, because, folks in our collective network that actually do stuff in terms of machine learning aspect, or are the IO or disinformation, misinformation experts, doing what we can to kind of like team up and get something like this solution going. There's certainly aspects here and there that are kind of like lower hanging fruit that, you know, I can see as, you know, like solutions to go after first. But I just wanted to throw it out there in terms of, because I don't know, like when I talk about Grimly for disinformation in terms of that tagline, it kind of sticks with folks like, oh yeah, that is the kind of stuff that we'd want. So I just throw out that term out there. Obviously, you can't call the product that, you know, wherever it comes from in terms of like trademarks, but it just kind of, it has a nice sticking point in terms of what folks that I talk to seem to really want from the solution. And it's certainly one that, you know, I'm trying to tackle as well, but it's not something that I can do by myself. So I throw it out to community as a concept. Feel free to, again, like add your thoughts and whatnot on that, and feel free to like reach out to me anytime, because yeah, it is something where I think I'd want something like that to exist to help out with our, you know, different information professionals out there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, along those lines, Sean, I will, and to our listeners, we had another episode with a gentleman named Bob Thibodeau,
Okay.
way back at the beginning of the Cognitive Crucible, episode number 5. But he actually has a project going on where it sounds like he's sniffing around the same space as what you're talking about here. It's called the Internet Court of Lies. And we'll have a link to this in the show notes. But his project is to put together like a court with a jury and a judge that actually deliberate on various different utterances and categorize them, and then eventually being able to use those judgments as part of an algorithm to help, you know, auto detect lies or disinformation and whatnot. Anyway,
No, that's fantastic, because
yeah.
getting the key to even something like that is getting a good labeled data set. And it sounds like something like that would be, you know, if they look at stuff like the biases and maybe different kind of fallacies, and then just other kind of like tricks and tropes that may be out there. Yeah, I could see something like that data set being extremely helpful for an algorithm like I discussed earlier. So yeah, that sounds like a fantastic initiative.
Right. Yeah, for sure. So we'll have a link to that in the show notes. Before I let you go, Sean, this has been a fascinating and fun discussion, by the way. But do you have a book recommendation for our audience that could or could not be related to kinds of things we've been talking about?
The one I kind of wanted to share with folks, has anybody talked about like Rory Sutherland's Alchemy?
That's a new one, I believe.
All right, so Alchemy, the dark art and curious science of creating magic in brands, business, and life, by Rory Sutherland, who is the vice chairman at Ogilvy. What's interesting about that book, it goes into stuff that what we now call like behavioral economics. The thing that was just so interesting about that, that I kind of wanted to bring up to the audience, is they were doing these sort of things at like these brand and advertising agencies, like utilizing like scientific and psychological methodology to study their customers and what they want more, and getting these same phenomena that, you know, have won people Nobel Prizes in terms of Kahneman and whatnot. But they did all this and they kind of didn't even have a name for what they were doing. It was before, again, like the concept of behavioral economics was a thing. But they were utilizing it, and they just called it, again, like a strange science, or the like whatever you call this. They didn't have a name for it. And that aspect, including some of the insights that I think are absolutely great, it kind of fits into well, I guess, like I said, I'll just take it on myself in terms of like, let me not speak for like anybody else. What I would think this kind of application of like neuroscience and psychology and defense and national security, sure, we call it in terms of things like cognitive security. If you talk to like the NATO Innovation Hub, they straight up call it cognitive warfare. If you talk to other folks, it's cognitive domain operations. Even some of the things I kind of categorize, I put it as like cognitive electronic warfare. They go by a lot of these different names, and it's just this field that you know yeah, I think I think we're really getting to somewhere, and I really do, if one were to follow the puck in terms of looking at uh, things with like disinformation, misinformation, turning from irregular to very much like the regular warfare, and these things in terms of electronic warfare weaponry that are directly targeting people, they're not going anywhere anytime soon. In terms of what people are terming as fifth generation warfare, I think it is something that's within this cognitive space, even if it doesn't have like a name that everybody agrees upon, and getting to the science that not only will like enable Nobel Prizes, but like will help save our country. I'd like to be helpful in terms of building up the capabilities and communities like that. And again, just to give a shout out to the IPA, y'all have certainly been helpful since I've been a member in terms of doing that, in terms of enabling those opportunities. And I hope to do what I can in terms of de-siloing and whatnot to uh, uh, help us out in terms of what I think the future of the space can be. So yeah, like I said, it had me, and again, all this came from this book, like in terms of alchemy. So I really want to suggest that to folks. And again, there's just excellent insight from folks that work in like big brand agencies that could be helpful in the space as well. So that's the one I wanted to share with folks.
All right, an excellent suggestion. And of course, we'll have links to all of these resources in the show notes. And with that, Dr. Sean Guillory, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.